Once upon a time, a hen told the most dreadful story ever told. It was so terrible, it made the other hen's feathers stand on end. It's quite true. But let's start at the beginning. One evening, a white-feathered hen was grooming herself and plucked a tiny loose feather out. The more I pluck, the prettier I'll get, she joked, for she was a jolly hen. And then she fluffed up the rest of her feathers, settled down on her perch, and fell fast asleep. But one hen who sat nearby overheard her. She was a rather stupid and noisy bird, and she thought that the little hen was serious. Hopping off her perch, she went and clucked the news to the other hens. It was the juiciest gossip she'd heard all week. Did you hear that? There's a hen here who plans to pluck out all her feathers to look more beautiful. If I were a rooster, I would despise her. Above the hen house was an ancient oak tree. Inside it lived a family of sharp-eared owls who heard every word that the foolish hen had said. They rolled their big round owl eyes in horror. Did you hear what that hen said? Hooted the mother owl. One of the hens has become so crazy that she sits and plucks her feathers out while the rooster watches. Little owls shouldn't hear such dreadful things, the father owl warned. He told the little birds to cover their ears, but it was too late. They rolled their eyes and flapped their wings at the shocking news. The mother owl was determined to share the shocking news with her neighbors. I must go tell the pigeons, she hooted. They won't believe it. So she swooped across the road to the pigeon house, where all the pigeons were nesting down for the night. She told them all about what she'd heard from the hen house. It's quite true. She must be freezing. The pigeons were just as scandalized by the rumor. They flew into the farmyard to tell the rest of the poultry about the vain hens. Coo, they squawked. The hens in the hen house are plucking out all their feathers to attract the rooster's attention. The rooster heard this just as he was waking up. He was still half asleep, but the news was enough to shock him into action. He flew up onto the fence to proclaim the day's news. Cock-a-doodle-doo, he crowed. 3 hens have died of a broken heart, all for the sake of a rooster. They've plucked all their feathers out. What a dreadful tale. He crowed so loud that a family of bats overheard him. They swung down from the belfry and began their own broadcast. Tell it everywhere, they shrieked. The hens clucked and the owls hooted, the pigeons cooed and the rooster squawked. The whole farmyard echoed with the scandal of the vain, feather-plucking hens. And the story was carried from hen house to hen house, from farm to farm, right across the country. He'd finally arrived back at the very same place it had started. There are 5 hens heartbroken over a rooster who have plucked out all their feathers to show who had lost the most weight. Then they pecked one another to death to the shame of their families. What vain and silly birds they are. Can you believe it? The jolly white hen who had lost the tiny feather clucked her disapproval. She didn't even recognize her own story. What a dreadful tale! I despise such hens, but their story should not be hushed up. It should be published in the newspapers and serve them right. And so the story was printed in the newspapers and known all over the kingdom. Everyone marvelled at the silly hens, so vain that they would pluck their own feathers out. And that's how one tiny feather can grow to become 5 hens. It's quite true.
Once upon a time, in a village far away, there lived 2 men, both called Klaus. One man owned 4 horses, so he was called Big Klaus. The other one only had 1 horse, so they called him Little Klaus. The whole week, Little Klaus had to plough for Big Klaus and lend him his only horse. In return, Big Klaus lent Little Klaus all his 4 horses, but only on Sundays. Each Sunday, Little Klaus proudly cracked his whip over all 5 horses. When he passed the other villagers going to church, he pretended as if he owned them. "Tally-ho, get up, all of my 5 fine horses," he cried. Big Klaus got annoyed. "Oi, stop pretending those are your horses. Otherwise I'll knock your nag down," he threatened. But another crowd of people came past, and Little Klaus couldn't resist showing off. "Get up, all my 5 horses," he said. Big Klaus was furious. He grabbed a mallet, clunked Little Klaus's horse on the head, and it dropped down, dead. Little Klaus was devastated. With nothing left in the world, he skinned his dead horse, put the hide in a big sack, and went to sell it at market. It was a long way, and he had to pass through a dark forest when a terrible storm blew up. He saw a nearby farmhouse and knocked on the door, but the farmer's wife wouldn't let him in. There was a large haystack nearby, and Little Klaus decided it would be a good bed. He climbed up and realized that he could see through the farmhouse window. There was the farmer's wife enjoying a nice fish supper with the sexton and drinking all the farmer's wine. Just then the sound of cartwheels came clattering along the road. The farmer was back. He wouldn't be happy to see his wife entertaining the sexton. Little Klaus watched through the window as the farmer's wife quickly hid the food and wine in the oven, made the sexton hide in a large chest. When the farmer approached the house, he saw Little Klaus on the haystack. "Who's up there?" he called. "It's a terrible night. Come inside for some shelter." Inside, the guilty-faced farmer's wife served them some plain porridge. Little Klaus would have much preferred the grilled fish and wine hidden in the oven, so he kicked his sack, making the hide squeak. "What's that?" the farmer asked. "It's a conjurer," Little Klaus lied. "He says we don't have to eat porridge, so he's conjured up some food and wine for us in the oven." The farmer opened the oven and was amazed to find the feast there. Little Klaus kicked the sack and made it squeak again. "What's your conjurer saying now?" the farmer asked. "He says he's conjured up the devil who looks just like the sexton, and he's hiding in your chest," Little Klaus fibbed. The farmer went to open the chest and saw the sexton, and quickly slammed it shut again. Amazed, he begged Little Klaus to sell him the conjurer and name his price. So Little Klaus agreed. For a bushel of money, a wheelbarrow, and the chest. He went on through the forest until he came to a deep, wide river with a very strong current, making it impossible to swim across. Fortunately, there was a brand new bridge over the river, and little Klaus wheeled the barrow halfway across. "What shall I do with this silly chest?" he said in a deliberately loud voice so the sexton could hear. "It's too heavy to wheel. I'll throw it in the river." "Don't!" the sexton cried furiously, hammering the side of the lid. "Let me out, I'll give you another bushel of money." So little Klaus let him out and put the second bushel in his barrow and wheeled it home. Big Klaus was shocked to see how much money little Klaus had. "Surely your horsehide couldn't have been worth that much?" he asked. "It certainly did," little Klaus lied. Big Klaus went and got his axe and killed and skinned his own horses. All day and night he shouted up and down the street, "Horses' hides! Horses' hides! Who'll buy horses' hides for a bushel apiece?" But the people laughed at his price, and then they got angry. "He's taking us for fools and trying to rip us off," they said. So the shoemakers took their straps and their tanners took their leather aprons, and they beat Big Klaus through the town. "We'll tan your hide if you don't get out of town," they threatened. Big Klaus was furious and determined that little Klaus wouldn't fool him again, so he grabbed him and threw him in a sack. "Now we'll take you to the river and drown you," he said. On the way, Big Klaus stopped to go to church, leaving the sack outside. Little Klaus struggled to get out of the sack and was spotted by an elderly drover. "Oh, I'm too young to be going to heaven," he cried from inside the sack. "And I'm too old for this earth, but heaven won't send for me," the old drover said. So little Klaus suggested they swap places, and the elderly drover was only too happy to agree. When Big Klaus came out of the church, he unknowingly picked up the sack with the drover, tossed him in the river, and drowned him. As he walked back, he was shocked to meet little Klaus on the road with the drover's herd of cattle. "How did you get here?" Big Klaus asked. "And where did you get those fine cows?" "When you threw me in the river, I ended up in the kingdom of the sea people," little Klaus told him. "They gave me this herd of magic cattle. There are hundreds of fine cows roaming around down there." "You're a lucky fellow," Big Klaus said. "How can I get some of those cows?" "You'll just have to go in the river," little Klaus told him. So Big Klaus got himself into another sack, and little Klaus rolled him in the water, where he sank to the bottom and was never seen again. "I'm afraid he won't find what I found," said little Klaus. He herded his cattle home, where his bushels of gold waited, and lived happily ever after. And that is a true story.
Once upon a time, the Emperor of China lived in the most beautiful palace in the whole world. The palace was built of porcelain, and in its gardens were exotic flowers hung with silver bells. Everyone noticed them when they walked by. Nearby was a dark forest that sloped down to the sea, where ships passed under the branches of trees. In the trees lived a nightingale with a song so exquisite that even the busy fishermen stopped to listen. The bird's fame grew. Travellers to the kingdom praised its song more highly than the emperor's palace. They wrote books and poems about the nightingale in the forest by the sea. The emperor read one of these books and demanded to see the nightingale. "Bring him to my palace. He will sing for me tonight," he commanded. But his courtiers had no idea where the bird was. Eventually, they found a little kitchen maid who said she would take them to it. The kitchen maid led them through the forest to a very tall tree. There, in the highest branches, was a small grey bird. "Little nightingale, will you sing for the emperor?" the kitchen maid asked. "I would be delighted," the bird said, and began to sing. He flew down from his perch, but my song sounds best in the woods. Back at the palace, the nightingale sang so sweetly that tears fell from the emperor's eyes. He sang even more beautifully, and the emperor's heart melted. He offered the bird his own golden slipper as a present. But the nightingale said that seeing tears in the emperor's eyes was the greatest reward. The emperor commanded that the nightingale should stay at court and have his own cage. He was allowed to go for a walk twice a day and once at night, accompanied by 12 footmen. But they tied ribbons to his legs to stop him flying away, so the poor nightingale was trapped and miserable. One day, the emperor received a large parcel. Inside was a golden clockwork nightingale studded with diamonds, rubies, and sapphires. When wound up with a key, it wagged its glittering tail and sang one of the nightingale's songs. The emperor ordered the birds to sing together, but it didn't work, because the real nightingale sang whatever song he liked, while the clockwork bird had only one song. But he was so pretty with his jewels that they made him sing it 30 times. When the clockwork bird finally stopped, the emperor discovered that the real nightingale had flown out of the window. He had returned to his forest home. "What an ungrateful bird!" the courtiers said. So they made the clockwork bird sing again and again, always the same song. It was given a cushion beside the emperor's bed. They titled it "Grand Imperial Singer of the Emperor to Sleep." The palace music master even arranged for the bird to give a concert. It sang perfectly, but some fishermen who heard it were disappointed. "There's something lacking," they said. After a year, the emperor, his courtiers, and all the people knew every trill of the song by heart. The whole country rejoiced at the clockwork nightingale's music. They loved to sing the song themselves. But then, disaster struck. One night, while mid-song, there was a twang and a whirr, and the bird broke down. The music stopped. A watchmaker was called to repair the bird, but he said its cogs and wheels were badly worn. If he replaced them, it would spoil the tune. So from now on, the bird must only sing once a year. 5 years went by and the whole country was in sorrow. The emperor fell ill and it was feared he would die. He lay stiff and pale in his magnificent bed with velvet curtains and gold tassels. The moonlight streamed through the open window onto the emperor and his broken clockwork bird. And the emperor thought that he saw Death sitting on his bed, wearing the emperor's crown and wielding his golden sword and banner. Strange and terrible faces appeared around the bed, whispering the emperor's deeds, both good and bad. "Sing, my precious golden bird, sing!" he cried. "Drown out these awful voices!" But the bird stood silent. There was no one to wind it or make it sing. Death kept staring at the emperor with cold, hollow eyes. Meanwhile, the phantom faces continued their terrible whispering. Suddenly, a beautiful burst of song came through the open window. It was the real Nightingale who had returned. He sang of comfort and hope. The phantom faces grew pale and started to fade away. As they did, the emperor felt blood beginning to flow more quickly through his veins again. "Sing on, little Nightingale," said Death. "I will give the emperor his crown, sword, and banner back for a song." So the Nightingale sang of the quiet churchyard where white roses grow, with green grass wet with the tears of the living. Death longed for his garden. He drifted away through the window as a cold, grey mist. The phantom faces vanished, and the emperor was strong and well once more. "How can I ever repay you?" the emperor said to the Nightingale. "You have already repaid me," the bird replied. "I saw the tears in your eyes the first time I sang." The emperor wanted the bird to stay with him always, but the Nightingale refused. "I cannot build my nest here or live in a palace. I will visit your window and sing to you of everything in your kingdom. But you must promise not to tell anyone that a little bird comes and sings to you." When the courtiers came in to look after their dead emperor, they were amazed to see him standing up, healthy and well. From then on, the Nightingale sang to him of his people, those who were happy and those who needed help. And the emperor became a better and more beloved ruler.
Once upon a time, many years ago, lived an emperor who adored expensive clothes. He didn't care about his soldiers, his palaces, or even his people. He only ever went outside his castle to show off his latest outfit. The emperor had 1,000 robes, 10,000 shoes, and a coat for every hour of the day. Instead of spending time with his advisors, he was always in his dressing room, preening in front of the mirror. One day, 2 wicked swindlers arrived in the city. They claimed to be weavers with an enchanted loom that wove the finest cloth in the world. The clothes it made were not only beautiful, but magic, they said. Only wise people could see them. To anyone stupid or unfit for office, the clothes would seem invisible. The emperor thought this was brilliant. If I wear clothes made of this material, I'll know by my men's reactions which ones I should sack, he thought. So he paid the wicked weavers 10 large chests of gold to make him some magic clothes. They set up their enchanted loom and demanded the rarest silk and the finest gold to make the clothes. But they stashed it all away in their bags and worked the empty loom far into the night. The emperor was desperate to know how the weavers were getting on. He had spent so much money, and he was worried whether the new clothes would be sufficiently stylish. He tried peeping through the window, but he couldn't see clearly enough. I'll send my faithful old minister to check their progress. He's an honest fellow and will give me a good report on how the material looks, the emperor thought. So the old minister was sent to visit the weaving room. There he saw 2 swindlers working away at their empty looms. Aren't these patterns exquisite? Isn't this colour divine? They asked him. The minister was terribly worried because he couldn't see a thing. Does this mean I'm an idiot and unfit for office because the clothes are invisible to me? He asked himself. He decided to keep it secret that he couldn't see them. No one must ever know. So what do you think? One of the wicked weavers asked him. Oh, they're the most beautiful clothes I've ever seen, the minister fibbed. Absolutely delightful. Soon, the emperor sent a second minister to view the weaving. He looked and looked, but couldn't see anything in the looms. Like the first minister, he was too scared to tell the truth, so he told the emperor that the clothes were wonderful. They are made of the richest silk in a dazzling rainbow of colours. I was spellbound. He lied. The emperor was so excited by the description that he decided he had to see the clothes for himself. Accompanied by his noblemen, he went to see the wicked weavers. Aren't they dazzling? Just look at the colours, his men said. They didn't dare admit that they could see nothing in the loom. The emperor was horrified, for he couldn't see a thing. Not one single thread or piece of fabric. Am I stupid? He thought. Does this mean I am unfit to be emperor? So he pretended he could see them. They're ravishing, spectacular. I give them my highest approval, he said. Everyone else stood around, looking at the empty looms, not daring to confess they saw nothing. One by one, they all joined the emperor in praising the invisible clothes. The emperor presented each of the swindlers with a medal and proclaimed them official royal weavers. The next day, the emperor returned with his ministers to collect the magic clothes. The wicked weavers raised their arms as though they were holding up a set of clothes. Here are the trousers, this is the coat, and here's the royal cloak, the first swindler said. They're lighter than cobwebs and softer than gossamer, the second swindler told him. You'll feel as though you're wearing nothing at all. The excited emperor took off all of his clothes, even his underpants. the two swindlers pretended to dress him in his new clothes. They fastened the invisible trousers and buttoned the invisible coat and arranged the invisible cloak around his shoulders. The emperor twirled in front of the mirror in delight, even though he still couldn't see or feel anything covering his body. The minister announced that it was now time for the grand procession, when the emperor would finally show off his wondrous new outfit to his people. He walked through the city under a golden canopy, feeling prouder than ever before. Never before had there been a ruler so magnificently dressed as he. On all sides, the people pretended to gasp with delight over the emperor's new clothes. "Bravo!" they cried. "Such eminence! Such style!" For they had all heard the rumors about the magic material, and no one wanted to be found stupid for not being able to see it. Then a little boy piped up from the back of the crowd. "Why hasn't the emperor got any clothes on? He isn't even wearing any underpants," he shouted. His father quickly hushed him and tried to apologize. "Please forgive him. He's only an innocent child. He doesn't know what he's saying." But the damage was done. The whispers started. They grew, and soon the whole town was crying out, "But the emperor isn't wearing any clothes!" The poor, foolish emperor at last realized they were right. No wonder he was starting to shiver with cold. But to save his dignity, he marched on to the end of the procession, with his noblemen still pretending to carry his invisible cloak. And from that day forth, he was known forevermore as the Emperor of No Clothes.
Once upon a time, in the bitter cold of the last night of the year, a wee girl walked through the darkening streets. She was all alone. Snow whirled all about, falling on her bare head, chilling her beneath her thin, ragged clothes. The girl had worn her mother's shoes when she had left the house, but now her feet were bare. The shoes were too big and had fallen off as she ran across the road, when two carriages rattled by dreadfully fast. A boy ran off with one shoe, and the other she could not find. So she wandered on her weary way, her tiny feet frozen by the cold cobblestones. She carried matches for sale in her apron, and held a box of them in her hand. But no one had bought any all day long, or given her a single penny. The girl shivered with cold and hunger as she walked past houses where other children were safe and warm in bed. Fires burned brightly for hogmanay, and there was a wonderful smell of roast goose. Soon she could go on no longer. She was so tired. She grew colder and colder, but couldn't return home with nothing for her parents. They had no fire and no food. The wind whistled through their leaky roof, and their blankets were damp and threadbare. The wee maid came to a narrow alleyway between two houses, where there was a shelter from the biting wind. She sat down, huddled into a shivering ball. Her hands were numb with cold. She rubbed them to try and get some feeling back, then wondered if the light of a match might warm them. She took one from her bundle and struck it. It burst into a tiny bright flame, like a little candle. She warmed her hands over it. All at once it seems as though she was sitting before a big fireplace filled with crackling logs. The smell of juniper and pine smoke curled through the air. For a moment she felt warmth and comfort. And then the match died and the fireplace faded away. She struck another. It flared up, and when its light fell upon the wall, it became transparent like a window. She could see inside the house. On the table, a snow-white cloth was spread, with silver dishes and crystal glasses. A roast goose sat in the middle, stuffed with apples and dried plums. To her astonishment, the goose jumped down from the dish and waddled over towards her. But just as it reached her, the match went out, and the wonderful room vanished. The girl lit a third match. Suddenly, she was sitting under a glittering Christmas tree, the most beautiful she had ever seen. Thousands of candles burned on its branches, and gold and silver baubles shone there like jewels. She reached out her hands towards them. But the match flame flickered out, and the tree lights rose up into the air, becoming stars. One shot across the sky in a long trail of fire. Someone is dying, thought the wee girl. Her old grandmother had once told her that when a star fell down to earth, a soul rose to heaven. She struck a fourth match, and in its glow, her grandmother appeared, clear and shining. She had died years ago, but in the magic light she stood there, as kind and lovely as the girl remembered. "Oh, grandmother, please take me with you," she cried. "I know you will disappear when this match burns out, just like the fireplace and the roast goose and the Christmas tree." Quickly, she struck the whole bundle of matches to try and keep her grandmother with her. The light was so brilliant it seemed brighter than the sun. Her grandmother reached out to her. She took the wee maid by the hand. They flew together up into the sky, into the stars, where she was no longer cold and no longer hungry. The next day, at the cold hour of dawn, passers-by found the poor girl in the alleyway. At first they thought she was asleep, for there was a rosy glow in her cheeks and she seemed to be smiling. But they could not wake her. She was stiff and cold, frozen to death in the winter's night. She still held her matches, of which one bundle was all burned up. The New Year's morning sun shone on her wee face. She only wanted to warm herself, the people said. If only we had shown her some kindness and welcomed her into our homes or bought her matches. But it was too late. No one would ever know the beautiful things she had seen, or that her grandmother had come to lead her away from the dark and the cold, or that the wee match girl was the first that new year to cross the threshold to a warmer and happier place, a land of stars and everlasting joy.
Once upon a time, far beneath the waves of a wide bay, lived a sea king who had 6 mermaid daughters. The youngest was the most beautiful, with rose-petal skin, sea blue eyes, and a shimmering tail. All the princesses had sea gardens, blooming with coral flowers. Each day they played their harps and sang to the sea. The youngest had the statue of a handsome boy in hers, a white marble figure lost in a shipwreck. She longed to know more of the world above the waves.
When you are 15, you can rise up out of the ocean,
her grandmother said.
You can sit on the rocks in the moonlight and sing to the great ships sailing by.
Finally, it was the youngest mermaid's turn. Above the surface sailed a great three-masted ship. She heard music and men's voices in choir. She swam outside the cabin window. Inside, she saw a young prince with big dark eyes, the crest of a red dragon on his breast, celebrating his birthday. Then a terrible storm broke. The waves rose high and lightning struck the sea. The ship pitched and creaked and gave way, its mast snapping in two. As the sailors were flung into the dark waters, the little mermaid looked for the prince. At first, she was overjoyed to see him sink into the sea towards her home. But then she remembered that human people could not live underwater. He must not die. She dived down fast and brought the prince to the surface. She held his head above water and carried him to a shore with fine white sand. He lay there still, like her marble statue. She kissed him and hoped he would live. Other people came to the beach and found the prince, and he awoke. They took him away to a castle by the sea. He did not know that the little mermaid had saved him, for she had hidden away. The little mermaid watched him outside the castle for many a night, and grew to love the prince and his fellow human beings.
They aren't like us,
her grandmother warned her.
We die and become sea foam, but they have an immortal soul that rises to the stars.
The little mermaid longed for her own soul.
You can only get one if a human loves you more than anything in the world,
Granny told her.
But then you'd have to swap your tail for 2 legs.
So the little mermaid decided to visit the sea witch for help. The witch lived in a seething mire of seaweed and slimy tentacles that clutched the bones of drowned men.
I know what you want, said the sea witch. I will give you a potion to turn your tail into legs, to win the prince's heart and gain a soul. But you can never be a mermaid again. My price is your voice.
The little mermaid turned pale with fear, for she loved to sing above all else. But she drank the magic draught and fell silent. She could no longer talk or sound a single note. She swam to the shore and walked on her 2 new legs to the prince's palace. The prince found her asleep on his marble stair and was mesmerized by her beauty. Even though she could not speak a word, they became inseparable companions and traveled everywhere together, over meadows, mountains, and misty valleys. One day came the terrible announcement that the prince must marry a princess from his own land. "My parents are forcing me to do this," he said, "but I want no other woman but you." The little mermaid could only sigh, for she was mute, and mermaids cannot cry. The king and queen paid an enchanter who lived in the Black Mountain to make their son a bride. He wove a maiden out of flowers, with skin of lilies and hair of bright gold daffodils. She was so beautiful that the prince fell in love with her at first sight. They were married, and the little mermaid felt her heart break. She returned to the sea and met her sisters. "We have cut off our long hair to pay the sea witch for help," they said. They handed the little mermaid an enchanted knife. "Use this to kill the prince, and his blood will turn your feet back into a tail." She went to the prince's bedchamber and watched him while he slept alongside his beautiful bride. And the little mermaid could not do it. Instead, she flung the knife into the waves of the bay, where it made the water boil red like blood. Then she cast herself into the sea and felt herself turn into foam. But what was this? She felt the warm sun on the chill foam, and she felt herself rising. High above, there was a host of ethereal beings, and she was now shaped like them. "We are the daughters of the air," they said. "You are one of us, as a reward for your suffering and loyalty. In 300 years, if you do enough good deeds, you may gain a soul." The little mermaid lifted her eyes towards the sun, and for the first time, her eyes were wet with tears. Unseen, she kissed the prince and blessed his bride. Then she flew with her new spirit sisters to the rose-red clouds on high.
Once upon a time, in a land far away, there lived a prince who wanted to marry a princess. He wanted a true princess, someone with grace and kindness and noble spirit. So he traveled far across the world, over wide oceans and rocky mountains, through dark forests and endless deserts to find her. The prince met hundreds of rich and glamorous royal ladies. They wore golden crowns, glittering with jewels, and lived in huge castles and marble palaces. They dressed in fine silks and velvets and threw feasts and dances in his honor. But not one of them seemed to him to be a true princess. There was always something about them that was not as it should be. They were vain, or they were greedy. Some were proud and others were arrogant. Nowhere could he find a lady who was pure and gentle, as a true princess should be. So he came all the way home again to his kingdom. The people rejoiced, for they loved their prince. But he was sad. He sat on his lonely throne, wondering if he would grow old before he found the lady he dreamed of. One evening a terrible storm blew up, shaking the sky with thunder and lightning and stirring the forests with violent winds. The rain poured down, people shuttered their doors and windows, and small creatures shivered with cold and fear in their burrows. Suddenly, in the middle of the night, a knocking was heard at the city gate. The old king got up from his bedchamber, wrapped himself in his cloak, and followed by the prince and his queen, he made his way through the bitter wind and rain to open it. There was a young woman standing there, drenched by the rain and wind. The water ran down from her hair and her clothes, into the toes of her shoes, and out again at the heels. She looked like a beggar, but on her head gleamed a thin circlet of gold. "I am a princess," she said, "and I seek shelter. My kingdom is lost, and I have nowhere to go." The prince was moved by her plight in the cold, dark night and welcomed her in. "My name is Valiant, Prince Valiant. At your service," he said. The queen looked the bedraggled visitor up and down. "We'll soon find out if she's telling the truth," she thought. She ordered her servants to prepare the best guest bedroom with its huge four-poster bed. At the very bottom of this bed, the queen laid a tiny pea. On top of it, she put 20 mattresses as plump and springy as marshmallows. Then her maids brought 20 quilts stuffed with the softest swan's down. On top of these, they laid 20 silk pillows filled with gossamer and clouds. The princess climbed up the huge mountain of bedding and had to lie there all night. All through the long night, she tossed and turned. No matter how she lay, something hard was digging into her. By morning, her skin was sore and bruised, and she was exhausted from lack of sleep. Pale and tired, she came down to breakfast with the king, the queen, and the prince. They asked how she had slept. "I thank you for your hospitality," the poor princess said, "but I'm afraid I could not sleep a wink. I scarcely closed my eyes all night. I was lying on something terribly hard, and I'm now black and blue all over my body." Because of this, they knew that she was a real princess. Only a true lady of the noblest blood could be sensitive enough to feel a tiny pea through 20 quilts, 20 mattresses, and 20 pillows. The prince was overjoyed. He had fallen in love with her from the first minute he'd seen her. Even when her hair was wet with rain and her clothes damp with mud. And even without the pea, he had guessed that she was a real princess. And now he asked her to marry him and share his kingdom. "I will marry you, but first I must save my people," the princess said. She told them how her country had been taken over by an evil sorcerer who had oppressed her people and banished her from her own home. The king promised to send his army to rescue her people and throw the sorcerer out. When the queen went to retrieve the pea, she was amazed to find that it had turned into a glittering emerald. Oh, not only is she a true princess, but she has fairy blood running through her veins, the queen thought. The emerald pea was set into a crown for the royal wedding, where it shone like a star over the princess. Afterwards it was put into the palace museum, where it was said to grant good luck to all that saw it. It may still be seen there, if no one has stolen it. This happened many centuries ago, in a land far away, but it is a true story.
Once upon a time, there were two children who lived next door to each other in a big city crowded with houses and people. They shared a tiny garden made of a window box where a rose bush bloomed until winter froze it away. Not far away, there was an evil hobgoblin who had a magic mirror. Everything beautiful that it reflected looked ugly, while hideous things looked wonderful. The hobgoblin flew into the sky with his mirror, but it slipped from his hands and smashed into millions of sharp splinters. They fell on the earth below. One wintry night, the boy, Kay, looked out of his window. Amid the whirling snow, he saw a tall woman, graceful and beautiful, who beckoned to him. But she was made of shining, glittering ice. He was frightened and hid under his warm blankets. Next summer, the rose bush bloomed again, and the girl, Gerda, sang a song beside it. When roses bloom so sweetly in the vale, the Snow Queen's evil power at last will fail. As Kay played nearby, he suddenly cried out in pain, "Oh, something hurt my heart, and there's something in my eye." Gerda tried to comfort him. They did not know that the splinters of the evil mirror had pierced him and would soon turn his heart to ice. As time passed, Kay grew cruel and rude and shunned his former playmate. One day he was riding his sled when he saw a magnificent white sleigh arrive. "That will go much faster than my sled," he thought, and jumped on the back. But the sleigh took off, faster and faster, flying through the snow. Kay was terrified. Finally, it stopped, and the driver stood up and turned to him. A tall figure, wearing a white fur coat and a cap made of snow. It was the Snow Queen. "Are you trembling from cold?" she asked him. She kissed his forehead, and for a moment he felt as though he was dying. Then he felt comfortable and realized he no longer felt the cold. The Snow Queen kissed him again, and he forgot Gerda, his parents, and his home. They flew away over forests and lakes, over many a land and sea. Below them the wind blew cold, and wolves howled. But up above, the moon shone bright and large, and Kay fixed his eyes on it throughout the long winter night. By day, he slept at the feet of the Snow Queen. Back home, Gerda searched everywhere for Kay. The snow melted and spring came, but there was no sign of him. So Gerda set off from her home to find him. Her journey first took her to a witch who lived in an enchanted flower garden. The witch wanted to keep Gerda and cast a spell of forgetfulness. but the witch was worried that her roses might remind the girl of Kay. So she pointed her crooked stick, and they sank down into the black earth. Held under a spell, Gerda stayed there. But one day, a sadness came into her heart, and her tears fell onto the earth, awakening the rosebush. As it bloomed before her, Gerda suddenly remembered everything. Kay isn't dead, the roses told her. We have been down in the earth where the dead people are, but Kay is not there. A crow flew into the garden. I think I have seen Kay, he said. He's now a prince, married to a princess in this very kingdom. Gerda went to visit the royal palace. But although the prince looked like Kay, it was not him. The princess was moved by Gerda's plight and gave her a golden carriage to help her with her journey. The carriage rolled on into a dark forest, where it was soon surrounded by robbers. They seized the horses and killed the coachman and dragged poor Gerda out. How tender she looks, they cried. What a dainty dish she will be. They kept her to fatten her up for their cooking pot, but a young robber girl took pity on her. Her name was Bay, and she had a pet reindeer. That night, while the robbers danced around their fire, some wood pigeons flew by. Kuroo! We have seen Kay, they told Gerda. He flew away with the Snow Queen to Lapland. Bay's reindeer spoke. The Snow Queen only lives in Lapland in summer. Her stronghold is a castle near the North Pole on the island called Spitsbergen. So Gerda travelled north on the reindeer's back. First she came to the hut of the Lapp woman who was cooking fish over a whale oil lamp. The Snow Queen is hundreds of miles to the north, the Lapp woman told her. Gerda travelled on to the hut of the Finn woman, who had mystical knowledge. While Gerda slept, the Finn woman spoke to the reindeer. Little Kay has splinters of glass in his heart and his eye. He will not be human until they are removed, she said. Can't you give Gerda a magic spell to give her more power than the Snow Queen? The reindeer asked. No power that I could give her could be as great as the innocence of her own heart. Don't you see how wise men and beasts are compelled to serve her, and how far she has come? The wise old Finn woman said. Gerda and the reindeer rode on to the Snow Queen's castle. It was defended by monstrous soldiers formed of snowflakes. They looked like snakes, bears, and porcupines. But Gerda said a prayer, and her frozen breath turned into angels who melted the snowflakes away. The walls of the castle were made of snowdrifts, and its vast, empty halls were lit by the flare of the northern lights. In the centre was a frozen lake where the Snow Queen sat with Kay at her feet. Kay was nearly blue with the cold, though he did not feel it, as his heart had nearly turned to ice. I am going to visit volcanoes in the hot countries, the Snow Queen told him, and flew away. Gerda found Kay there, alone, stiff and still, nearly frozen to death. She threw her arms around him, and her warm tears fell over him, going straight to his heart. They burned away the icy splinter there. When roses bloom so sweetly in the vale, the Snow Queen's evil power at last will fail, Gerda sang. Kay cried out in happiness, "My beloved Gerda, where have you been for so long? And where have I been? How cold and empty it is here." Hand in hand, they left the wintry castle. As they journeyed south, the bitter wind died down, and the sun shone out. Green buds were all around them in the forest, and birds sang. As Kay and Gerda reached home, they had forgotten the Snow Queen, as though she was nothing but a bad dream. Everything seemed just as it was. But when they entered the door, they realized they were no longer children, but grown up. So they sat by their rose bush, grown up, but still children at heart. And it was summer, warm, glorious summer.
Once upon a time, there were 25 tin soldiers painted with bright uniforms of red and blue. They were all brothers, cast from the same old tin spoon. Each soldier looked exactly alike, except for one. He was the last to be made, and the tin had run out, leaving him with only one leg. But he stood just as steadfast as his brothers. The soldiers belonged to a small boy. He had dozens of toys, from balls and clowns to a magnificent model castle. The castle had high walls and turrets and windows to peep inside. White wax swans swam outside on a lake of mirror surrounded by miniature trees. But most beautiful of all was the tiny dancer who stood at the castle door. She wore a necklace hung with a glittering sequin. Because she stood in pirouette on one foot, the tin soldier thought she must just have one leg like him. "Oh, she is so lovely," he sighed, "but she is too grand to be the wife of a simple soldier like me." So the little tin soldier hid behind a snuff-box and admired the dancer from a distance. No matter how long she stood on one leg in her pirouette, she never lost her balance. At night, the boy put all his toys away. 24 of the soldiers went back into their box. But the little tin soldier, hiding behind the snuff box, was left outside. As soon as everyone in the house was asleep, the toys got up and began to play. They danced and fought battles and held picnics. The tin soldiers wanted to join in but was stuck in their box. They rattled the lid, but it wouldn't come off. The only two who stayed still were the one-legged tin soldier and the little dancer. She remained in her eternal pirouette, balanced on one toe, and he stood steadfast, gazing at her with love. But then the clock struck 12, there was a rap and a tap, and suddenly the lid flew off the snuff-box. Out sprang a mischievous troll. He was a nasty creature with wild hair and an evil eye, and he wanted the dancer for himself. "Take your eyes off her," he told the soldier. The soldier pretended not to hear, but the wicked troll threatened him. "Just you wait until tomorrow." The next morning the boy found the little toy soldier behind the snuff-box and put him on the windowsill. Suddenly there was an evil cackle from the snuff-box, and a strange gust of wind blew the window open and knocked the tin soldier down into the street. The boy and his nursemaid ran down to find him. They looked all around, and although they nearly stepped on him, they didn't spot him. The soldier was too proud to shout out, thinking it was wrong to do so in uniform. So he was left in the street until it started to rain heavily. The water trickled over the cobblestones into puddles and streams surrounding the little soldier. When the rain cleared, 2 ragged urchins came by. "Look, here's a tin soldier, he's going for a sail," they said. They made a boat out of newspaper, put him in it, and set it off down the gutter. The rushing water carried the soldier along at a fearful speed, but he stood there bravely on his single leg. Suddenly the water whirled the boat around and washed it into a dark drain. "Oh, where am I going?" the little soldier wondered. "This must be the evil troll's revenge. Oh, if only I had the beautiful dancer with me, I wouldn't mind being wet and cold and seasick." Suddenly a huge water rat ran out and bared its yellow fangs. "Where's your passport?" the rat demanded. "Hand it over." But the tin soldier had no passport and refused to answer. "Stop him, he hasn't got a passport," shouted the angry rat, but the boat sailed on. Soon the little soldier glimpsed daylight ahead, but as it grew brighter he heard a terrifying roar of water where the gutter poured into the great canal. The current grew stronger. There was no way back. The little soldier stood bravely as he was rushed over the edge in a huge waterfall. The boat plunged into the whirlpool below. It spun around once, twice, 3 times, filling up with water. The tin soldier thought of the beautiful dancer, whom he would never see again, and an old song rang in his ears. "Farewell, farewell, O warrior brave, nobody can from death thee save." The paper boat began to break apart. The soldier sank through and was swallowed whole by a huge fish. Oh, it was dark and dank inside the fish's belly, but the soldier clutched his musket firmly, even as the fish flopped and floundered around. Finally, the fish was still. A fisherman had caught it and delivered it to a kitchen table. A cook sliced it open, and the soldier saw daylight again. "It's the tin soldier," the cook said. She went upstairs to the nursery and gave him to the young boy. The tin soldier was back home again, and everything was just as it was. There was the boy, there were all the toys, and there was the magnificent castle. of all, the love of his life, the little dancer, still stood there, steadfast in her pirouette. He would have wept tears of joy, but soldiers never cry. The tin soldier and the dancer gazed at one another, but neither of them moved. Then suddenly the boy picked up the soldier and threw him into the fire. He had no reason to hurt the poor soldier. The evil troll must have cast a spell on him. The tin soldier stood there in the fierce heat, but he could not tell if it was the fire or the love that burned him. A long journey had worn his painted uniform away, and now he was brightly dressed again, in a livery of flames. He looked over at the dancer, and she looked at him, and still he stood steadfast, shouldering his musket. Then a gust of wind struck the dancer. She flew like a sylph across the room and into the fireplace next to the melting soldier. For a moment, she flared up into a pale flame, and then was gone. The next day, when the maid cleared the ashes, she found the soldier's remains. He had melted into the shape of a little tin heart. But nothing was left of the dancer, except her silver spangle, and it was burned as black as coal.
Once upon a time, in a summer long ago, the wheat fields were golden, the oats were green, and the hay was stacked high in the meadows. A magnificent old manor house stood surrounded by woods and ponds. The reeds had grown so high that summer that they nearly hid the water from view. Hidden in the reeds, a mother duck had made her nest, safe from weasels and the wily fox. She sat on her eggs, getting rather bored, for they took their time to hatch. Finally, she felt a tap, 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 and cracks started to appear in the smooth shells. With a pop and a peep, peep, a bunch of golden ducklings appeared. Their mother gave a delighted quack as she counted each fluffy gold head. But wait, the largest egg in the nest, her secret pride, was still there. Never before could she remember laying such a huge and splendid egg. How much longer would it take? Suddenly, there was a tap and a crack and a pop. The ducklings and their mother excitedly awaited the arrival of their final sibling, but they quacked with horror at the baby bird who emerged. For he was big and grey and ugly. He had huge feet and a broad beak and looked nothing like his brothers and sisters. The next day, the weather was perfectly splendid, and the ducklings went for their first swim. One by one, they plunged into the water, bobbing along in a golden line. Even the big grey duckling could swim. Despite his ungainly size, he held himself upright in a graceful style. Mother Duck quacked with delight. "See how nicely he uses those big feet. He is my very own son after all. Now follow me closely and watch out for the cat."
duck family waddled on their way into the yard. The sight of the big grey duckling caused an immediate commotion. "How strange he is," the other ducks said. "Look at his huge feet and his dull grey feathers. We won't stand for such an ugly fellow in our yard." And a handsome drake flew over and nipped him in the neck. "Leave him alone. He's not doing any harm," quacked Mother Duck. "He's too big and strange," the handsome drake replied, "and therefore he needs a good whacking." An elderly mallard peered down her beak at Mother Duck's brood. "Your other children are very pretty," she said, "but not that one. He's the wrong shape. It's a pity you can't hatch him again." Mother Duck was sad. She knew he was big and grey and ugly, but he was still her little duckling. Alas, life only got worse for the poor ugly duckling. Every day he was pecked and pushed and jeered and joshed by the ducks and even the chickens. "He's too big, he's too ugly," they clucked. Gobbler the turkey was the worst. He puffed up like a ship under full sail and gobbled at him until he was red in the face. One day, the poor ugly duckling could take it no more. He ran far away from home until he ended up at a swamp where only wild ducks lived. "You're an ugly fellow," the wild ducks told him, "but you can stay here, so long as you don't marry any of us." But the poor ugly duckling wasn't thinking of marriage. He just wanted to hide away in the reeds where no one could see him and mock him. One day, a pair of travelling geese stopped by. "Hello, friend," they honked. "You're so ugly that we rather like you. Why don't you become travelling birds like us?" They told him of a wonderful marsh nearby, full of charming lady geese. "They'll adore you," the kind geese promised. But just as the three birds took flight, there was a terrible bang, bang of gunshots ringing in the air. The ducklings' new friends dropped down dead into the rushes, and the waters ran red with their blood. Immediately, hunters and gun dogs came splashing through the swamp. The poor ugly duckling was terrified, but there was no time to hide in the reeds. One dog bared sharp fangs right at him and opened his wide jaws, but just as he was about to bite the duckling, he suddenly turned and ran off. "I'm so ugly that even a dog won't eat me," the poor duckling thought. He didn't know whether to be glad or sad. Winter arrived, bitterly cold. The water froze, and one night the duckling got stuck in the ice. He sat there until morning, when a farmer caught sight of him. He broke the ice with his wooden shoe and carried the duckling home to warm him by the fireside. But the duckling was terrified. He fluttered into the milk pail, splashing it all over the room, and landed in the butter tub. The farmer's wife was furious and chased him out into the cold. Back in the swamp, he spent a long and lonely winter, struggling to survive. At last the snows melted away and the larks began to sing. It was spring, and the duckling unfolded his wings. They were bigger and stronger than before, and carried him high into the air. Before long, he found himself by a lovely lake, surrounded by lilacs and apple blossom. 3 magnificent swans, white and graceful, swam there. Their beauty filled the ugly duckling with despair. I'm so drab and grey, they will peck me to death, he thought. Though perhaps it's better to be killed by these majestic birds than scorned and starved. He bowed his head in misery, but as he did so, he suddenly saw his reflection in the water and got a shock. His ugly feathers were now snowy white. His neck was curved and slender. He had grown into a swan. The other swans glided over to him. Instead of biting him, they stroked him with their beaks. Nearby children shouted with joy at the sight of him. "There's a new swan," they cried, and threw him some crumbs. "Once I was an ugly duckling," he said, "and now I am the most beautiful of birds." But because he knew what it was like to be shunned and bullied, he was never cruel to another creature, and became the noblest of swans that ever lived.
Once upon a time, there lived a woman who was desperate to have a child. Time passed, and still no baby arrived. So the woman went to an old witch for help. The witch gave her a magic barley grain, which grew into a beautiful tulip. When the petals opened, a tiny girl sat inside. She was called Thumbelina, as she was only as tall as a thumb. She slept in a walnut shell with roses and violets for pillows and blankets. The woman gave Thumbelina a bowl of water and a tulip petal for a boat. But one day, a horrible mother toad crept in through the window and kidnapped her. The toad wanted Thumbelina to marry her nasty, slimy son. So she took her to her house in the middle of a pond and trapped her on a lily pad. But the little pond fishes nibbled through the stem to free the tiny girl. She sailed down the river until a pretty white butterfly fluttered onto her leaf. Thumbelina tied her sash to it and sailed much faster. But then an ugly May-bug swooped down and carried Thumbelina to his home, high in a tree. All the other May-bugs came to stare at her and laugh at her for being ugly, because she only had 2 legs and no feelers. They left her on a daisy, and she spent the summer all alone. In the winter, even the birds flew away, and she nearly froze to death, wrapped only in a withered leaf. Finally, a kind field mouse took her in, She offered her a home in return for telling her stories. The field mouse's neighbour, a mole in a black velvet coat, came to visit. He fell in love with Thumbelina. The mole invited her to his dark, earthy home of long tunnels, where she found a dying swallow. Thumbelina took the bird home and warmed him, and nursed him back to health. By spring, the swallow was strong again, and he offered Thumbelina a ride on his back. But she didn't want to upset the field mouse, so she stayed with her instead. Thumbelina sadly said goodbye to the swallow, and he flew away, far above the treetops. The mole wanted to marry Thumbelina, so the field mouse hired 4 spiders to weave her wedding clothes. By autumn they were ready, and the field mouse told Thumbelina it was time for her wedding day. But the tiny girl cried, because she didn't want to live underground. Farewell, she said to the sun and the flowers. Thumbelina thought she would never see them again, as the mole hated sunshine. Just then she heard a chirping. It was her friend, the swallow. He offered to fly her to warmer countries for winter. She flew on his back to a sunny land, rich with fruit trees and coloured butterflies. There, inside a large white flower, she found a tiny man wearing a golden crown. He was a flower spirit. He was handsome and kind, and he soon fell in love with Thumbelina. He asked her to marry him and put his golden crown on her head. Your name shall be Maya, he told her, for Thumbelina is too ugly, and you are so pretty. At the wedding, a fly gave her a pair of silver wings, so she could fly from flower to flower. The swallow was sad to say goodbye to the happy couple, for he loved Thumbelina dearly as his friend. So he flew all over the world, telling the tale of Thumbelina.
Once upon a time, in a land far away, a soldier came marching down the road. He was coming home from the wars, with his sharp sword at his side and his heavy pack on his back. On the road, he met a hideous old witch with a pointed nose.
Good evening, soldier. What a fine sword you have. If you help me, I will let you in on a secret to get more money than you could ever dream of.
The witch pointed to a nearby tree.
That tree is hollow. Climb down with a rope, and you will find a vast hall lit by 100 lamps. There are 3 doors to 3 rooms, each guarded by a huge dog. Take my magic apron to protect yourselves from the dogs. All I ask in return is for you to bring back my grandmother's old tinderbox that she forgot down there. The soldier was excited by the thought of all the treasure. He climbed down inside the tree and entered the first room. It was filled with copper, guarded by a dog with eyes as big as saucers. The soldier put the dog on the enchanted apron and stuffed his pockets with copper. The second room shone with silver, and the dog guarding it had eyes as big as mill wheels. Once again, the soldier used the apron to calm the animal and crammed as much silver as he could into his boots. The third room glittered with piles of golden coins. The guard dog had eyes as big as the moon, but once again, the magic apron protected the soldier. He got rid of his copper and silver and loaded himself up with gold instead. He was so excited that he nearly forgot the tinderbox and had to go back to retrieve it. "Pull me up now, you old witch," the soldier called. With his own pockets bulging with gold, he carried the tinderbox. "What are you going to do with it?" he asked. "That's none of your business," the old hag cackled. "You've got your money. Now hand it over." But the soldier demanded that the witch tell him the secret of the box. She refused. So he waved his sword and chased her away, then gathered up his money and the tinderbox and went on his way. That night, he stayed in the best room at a nearby inn, enjoying the finest food and drink. He bought himself fashionable clothes and expensive boots. The people were so impressed, they thought he must be a nobleman. "Our king has the most beautiful daughter in the world," they told him. "But there's a prophecy she'll marry a common soldier. So the king keeps the princess locked up in the tower of a great copper castle, and no one can get in to see her." The soldier thought this was sad and wondered about the princess's beauty. As he went on his way, he gave a lot of his money to poor people because he remembered what it was like going hungry. Finally, he ended up with nothing left and had to live in an attic and clean his own boots again. All his friends deserted him, for they had only been attracted by his wealth. One evening, the soldier suddenly remembered the mysterious tinderbox. It was one of the few possessions he had left. He drew it out and struck a spark from the flint. The door burst open, and there stood the copper dog with eyes as big as saucers. "What is your command?" the dog asked him. The soldier was amazed. He ordered the dog to get him some money, and it returned with a bag full of copper. He soon discovered that he could strike the box twice to get the silver dog with eyes as big as mill wheels. If he struck 3 sparks, the gold dog with eyes as big as the moon appeared. Once again, the soldier became rich, and all his friends flocked back to him. But this time, he had a bigger ambition. He was haunted by the thought of the beautiful princess held in the copper tower. So he summoned the copper dog.
bring me a glimpse of the princess," he commanded. At once, the dog vanished and reappeared with the princess on his back, fast asleep. She was so beautiful, the soldier couldn't resist kissing her before the dog took her home. The next morning, the princess told the king and queen about her strange dream. "I rode on a dog's back and a soldier kissed me." The king was suspicious and ordered an old woman to sit by the princess's bed that night. When the dog came again, the old lady pulled on her boots and followed them. With a piece of chalk, she drew a white cross on the door of the house they entered. But the copper dog spotted the chalk and marked every door in town to look exactly the same. So the king and queen were unable to figure out which door it was. The next night, the queen tied a bag of flour to the princess's back and snipped a small hole in it. It left a fine trail of flour wherever the princess went. The dog came again for the princess, but didn't spot the flour. The next day, the king and queen followed the trail, found the soldier, and threw him in prison. It was dark and dismal in the prison, and the soldier didn't have his tinderbox. He looked through the bars of the window, and by chance saw a shoemaker's boy running past. "Hey there! If you can fetch my tinderbox, I'll give you 4 coppers, the soldier promised him. Soon, the magical box was back in his hands. The king and queen had ordered a high gallows to be built to hang the soldier. But just as they were putting the rope around his neck, he asked to smoke one last pipe. The king couldn't refuse, and the soldier struck the tinderbox. Once, twice, thrice, the 3 enchanted guard dogs appeared. "Save me," he ordered them. So the dogs growled at all the guards and officials and chased them out of the kingdom. "Don't touch me," the king cried. But the dogs ignored him. They growled at the king and queen until they ran away as well, never to be seen again. The people cheered and shouted for the soldier to become their king. So the soldier sat in the king's carriage with the beautiful princess at his side. The dogs danced in delight in front of them. The wedding lasted a whole week, and the 3 magic dogs sat by their table all the while, wagging their copper, silver, and gold tails.